I spoke with John Lipsky, and I asked him whether there are shared norms at the national level.
Well, this will certainly be an important year for the process of policy coordination, collaboration, better put, in the Group of 20. As you know, the Seoul Leaders Summit instructed their ministers to conduct a process of the mutual assessment process during this year. First, to agree on a set of indicative guidelines for judging economic performance against each country's own policy programs, and then asking the fund as an input to their discussions to provide an independent assessment of their monetary, fiscal, structural, and exchange rate policies. And then the G20 will come together and compare notes, see how they're doing, and see where they're headed. This will be an important test of this process.
As you know well, I don't have all the answers. Some people think I actually know what's going on. I learn things as I come here. And one thing I learned in my panel from Il Keene of the Republic of South Korea, the strong support of G20, and someone like Ian Bremmer pushing against that with his concept of G0. Where are we within G20 and G0?
Well, I would say first, think about how this has progressed. In Pittsburgh, there was an agreement on this framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. In the Toronto summit, the leaders agreed to take this down to individual country levels. In Seoul, they delivered a 49-page document of policies that they intended to implement in support of their goals. And now, this year, this new process of indicative guidelines, independent assessment, and a peer review process. And I think that there's more to it than most people seem to understand.
This is what I hear from people. Great. What's the next step for G20 then? If we went Pittsburgh, Korea, what is the next step that our viewers and our listeners can understand will be down the road? Is it simply more coordination? Is it a better photo shoot? What is for the cynics? It's one big photo shoot. What is the next step for G20?
Well, it seems to me that many of the critics haven't really paid close attention to the machinery that's being set up by the Group of 20 to carry this as an ongoing process of policy coordination and collaboration. There's an agreement, it seems to me, at the level of the G20, certainly at the technical level, an understanding that coherent policies will produce better outcomes for everybody. So the incentive to follow this process is very straightforward. Everyone benefits.
Everyone benefits, and I have seen a wonderful change at the IMF. Just in a minute here, the Blue Book, the Green Book, and now the Brown Book, the Fiscal Monitor. It's a terrific research effort. What have you learned about the IMF's Fiscal Watch in the past 3 months, past 6 months?
Well, what we all know is that all the advanced economies are going to be facing significant medium-term fiscal challenges. They need to adjust. What we've shown is that they need to start soon. Not necessarily, the adjustment can take a while, but it seems very advantageous to lay out a policy program to make the path clear towards medium-term adjustment.
Do you need action or do you need rhetoric? Just quickly here. We
need rhetoric and action that doesn't have to be. All the problem's going to take years to solve, but the path needs to be laid out. We studied the situation and said part of the problem are structural problems, call them, on both the supply and the demand side. On the supply side, higher prices are not leading to the kind of investment that would be necessary to increase the supply over time. Secondly, on the demand side, in many countries, subsidies are provided on a wholesale basis. Everyone gets subsidies, whether they need them or not, rather than targeting. And as a result, high market prices don't necessarily get reflected at the consumer level, and so that doesn't modulate demand.
So I'm going to rip up the script here. This is really important. You look at Indonesia as an oil producer, and yet they're a net oil importer. There's a supply and demand function here that so much of the public doesn't understand. And we don't need to go into an argument on rice, but the cultural and separate national minutiae here is much more important than quick sound bites or quick trends.
Indeed. We had said in 2008 the global downturn was going to remove the pressures for a time, temporarily. But unless there were improvements made, as I say, both supply and demand side, we knew that when the recovery came, that the price pressure was going to return. So now real work needs to be done on all these areas.
Prime Minister Papandreou sat in this chair with me and spoke, as he would, optimistically about a Greek recovery, and we did come down to this ballet of restructuring, taking a haircut, the default. What would the IMF like to see out of peripheral Europe right now? What do we need to see in the next 90 days besides further economic recovery?
Well, for sure, the two most dramatic cases, Greece and Ireland, are now under programs supported by their European partners and by the IMF. They involve significant policy adjustments to put those economies on a sustainable basis, avoiding the need for debt restructuring. So what is needed is a continuation of what they've been doing so far, certainly in the Greek case, have been implementing some really difficult but necessary policy adjustments. And on the Irish side, of course, that's a new policy with a new government, and so they need to deliver.
Roy Smith at NYU talks about Trichet bonds. Maybe we could call them Lipsky bonds. I think that would be good. Excuse me, Strauss-Kahn bonds. But if you look at a Brady bond equivalent, is that a feasible outcome here to do two things? One, to get the job done, and also that deeply emotional national issue of saving face. Can we do it with a Brady bond model?
But Tom, as I said, the cases that were really extremely difficult, Ireland and Greece, the decision was made to go another way, to put in place programs that would avoid a need for debt restructuring. They involve big policy adjustments, and hopefully they will continue to be successful. For other peripheral countries that are under market strain, they need to continue to introduce policy changes that will increase confidence of investors of the ability of those economies to move forward.
Carlo Collarelli has a sector chart, a scattered out chart with two vectors, and the ugliest vectors ex-Greece are the United Kingdom and the United States. We focus on
Japan.
The peripheral nations, and Japan, of course, and yet here we are, the ugliest arrow on the chart. What do you need to see from the United States and Japan?
In those cases, as I said before, all advanced economies are facing the need for medium-term fiscal adjustment. In the U.S., especially in the U.K., in Japan, the medium-term needs are created by demographics and by entitlement programs that need to be addressed. That's why this can be a medium-term process, but it has to have credibility, and have credibility. It has to be clear and has to have a beginning.
A better buoyant tone here at Davos, and yet I'm calling it the Davos of our discontent, and that under it there are still these challenges: jobs, housing in the United States, unemployment in Spain, and many, many others.
Yes.
What is the discontent you're focused on?
Well, obviously, we want to continue to make progress in treating the severe strains in Europe. We want to see success in beginning the process of fiscal adjustment in the advanced economies. And we're starting to see incipient signs of overheating in the rapidly growing emerging economies. They need to start taking back the stimulative policies put in place to resist the crisis in 2008, 2009. And to make sure that their rapid growth can be sustained without producing the kind of imbalances that decades ago used to be associated with emerging markets.
You were 4 years into your public service at the IMF. What's been the biggest surprise? Besides they gave you a financial crisis, other than giving you a financial crisis, what's been the biggest surprise of working with the IMF?
Surprise. Let's not call it a surprise, but let's say the most notable development certainly was how the global community, especially in the context of the G20, was able to come together, take coherent and decisive action in the face of an unexpectedly severe crisis.
We'll get you out of this cold here. Just one last question.
Enjoyable.
Barry Eichengreen, always thoughtful and globalizing capital and golden fetters. He speaks of Giscard d'Estaing's exorbitant privilege, the idea of the advantage the United States has of having this reserve currency. The exorbitant privilege of the developed world, centuries of development that have led up to real economic growth. How do we sustain the exorbitant privilege of economic growth for the haves of the world?
Indeed. One remark here. remember, of international reserves, only about 60% are U.S. dollars. So we're already in a multi-currency world. But your question was, how do we sustain the privilege of growth? And I think it's very clear. There's a set of policies that need to be, policy changes that need to be implemented by advanced economies, emerging economies, surplus economies, deficit economies. They're all somewhat different, but it's well accepted what needs to be done. There needs to be this collaborative spirit, coherent policies, mutually supportive policies that will produce the results of strong, sustainable, and balanced growth.
This interview was a failure. We didn't even get to talk about China. We'll do that next time. John Lipsky, thank you.
Well, I've enjoyed it.
John Lipsky of the IMF.